Although African Americans had participated in every major conflict since the Revolutionary War, they had done so almost completely segregated. During World War II, more than 1.5 million African Americans served in the United States Armed Forces during World War II, while still encountering unequal treatment and racial segregation in the United States military. And if this is the type of content that you enjoy, you can find more content like this at onemikehistory.com. Also, if you want to support the channel, you can do so on my Buy Me Coffee or my Patreon page in the description below. Also, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and go support the YouTube channel. Without further ado, let's get started. With lynching and racial violence surging at the end of World War I, the years after the Great War saw very few changes with regards to social, political, and economic status for African Americans. Despite their service and sacrifice, Black veterans did not secure their own full citizenship. They were met only with more racism and more violence. So as the United States prepared to enter World War II, the treatment of African Americans increasingly became under scrutiny as another generation considered whether military service might be a chance to force actual progress. After the disappointing treatment of African Americans during World War I, Black leaders sought some leverage from the United States war rhetoric to ensure equal treatment for African American servicemen during World War II, including a chance to actually fight and maybe gain the same respect afforded to white troops. Leaders like W.B. Du Bois urged Black Americans to put their grievances aside during the First World War. So at the start of World War II, Du Bois again asked Black Americans to fight for democracy, while sadly admitting that the First World War did not bring us democracy, and nor will the Second. But Hitler needed to be stopped. On April 16th, 1940, the United States instituted the Selective Training and Service Act. It required that all men from ages 21 to 45 register for the draft. Civil rights leaders pressured Franklin Delano Roosevelt to allow Black men the opportunity to serve in integrated regiments. Although African Americans had participated in every single conflict since the Revolutionary War, they had done so completely segregated, and Henry Stinson, War Secretary, was completely uninterested in changing that status quo. So FDR decided that Black men could register for the draft, but they would remain segregated, and the military would determine how Blacks would be inducted into service. The Selective Service Act did allow for African Americans to join the military in numbers proportionate to their representation in the United States, and also provided for Black and white officers to be able to train together, and in addition to establishing an aviation training school for Black officers. After the United States entered World War II, African Americans created the Double V Campaign in 1942 in support of the nation's war effort. The V was World War II's symbol that unified the war effort to achieve victory for democracy over tyranny of the Axis powers. So the Double V Campaign called for a victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. The Double V Campaign had some limited success, and it helped create some legal and policy changes, but failed to achieve actual equality within the United States military. Around that same time, in 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which outlawed racial discrimination in the war industry. It established the Fair Employment Practices Commission to enforce the executive order, but they didn't actually have any authority to regulate employment practices, and faced increasing resistance from southern states. Alabama Governor Franklin Dixon refused a government contract to operate cotton mills in state prisons rather than agree to the FEPC's non-discriminatory requirements. And without southern states' participation, the Fair Employment Practices Committee was doomed. Just 1 year after the creation of the FEPC, African Americans comprised just 3% of all war workers, and by 1946, Southern Democrats had eliminated funding for the FEPC, so in June of 1946, the Fair Employment Practices Committee was dead. Despite African Americans' eagerness to fight in World War II, the same Jim Crow discrimination in regular society was practiced in almost every branch of the military. Many bases, training facilities were located in the South, and regardless of regions, all bases had separate blood banks, hospitals, medical staff, barracks, recreational facilities for Black soldiers. White soldiers and local white residents routinely harassed them, and despite this, African Americans joined up in increasing numbers. In 1941, there were fewer than 4,000 4,000 African Americans serving in the armed forces, with only 12 officers. By 1945, there was 1.2 million Black Americans serving in uniform, with about 4 million women joining the Women's Army Corps. The Women's Army Corps was a branch of the United States Army created as an auxiliary unit in May of 1942. While serving abroad, the military simply didn't think that African Americans were fit for leadership service or even combat. Both African American men and women were mostly relegated to labor and a service unit. And for the few who did make officer rank, they could only lead other Black men and weren't allowed higher positions. These beliefs not only stalled the use of African American troops in combat, but it also excluded them from higher recognition for their service in World War II. It wasn't until 1993 that the first African American was awarded the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II. While Black troops were initially barred from frontline combat, as casualties started to mount among white soldiers during the final years of the war, the military had no choice but to utilize African Americans as infantrymen, officers, and pilots. In addition to remaining invaluable in supply divisions, from August 1944 to November 1944, the Bread Ball Express, a unit comprised mostly of Black drivers, delivered gasoline, ammunition, food, mechanical parts, and medical supplies to the Third Army in France. They drove up to 400 miles on narrow roads in the middle of the night without headlights to avoid detection. In November of 1944, the 761 Tank Battalion became the first Black division to see ground combat in Europe, joined the Third Army in France. The men helped liberate 30 towns under Nazi control and spent 183 days in combat. The Tuskegee Airmen, an all-Black fighter group, escorted bombers over Italy and Sicily and flew almost 1,600 combat missions while destroying 237 German planes. Once again, despite these heroics, Jim Crow continued to be the law of the land for Black servicemen. Black MPs stationed in the South could not enter restaurants where German POWs were allowed to eat. Private Bert Barotto talked about the racism within the military in a letter to Truman Gibson, the civilian aide for the Secretary of War. He observed a sign over a latrine actually segregating a section of the latrine for Negro soldiers. The other was to be used by German soldiers and white soldiers. He recalled that the sign made him feel like the tyrant was actually being placed over the liberator. Nazi leaders understood this American hypocrisy and sought to demotivate Black soldiers by confronting them on this very subject. Germans would drop leaflets mocking Black troops, asking why would you serve a military that treats you less than human beings, and the leaflets would state things like, "You've done this before, and look where it got you, and why does this matter to you?" Black communities also faced an onslaught of racial attacks during World War II. In June of 1943, riots in Beaumont, Texas, and Detroit led to the deaths and injuries and economic loss, and only served to deepen racial hostility. The sense of pride from the African American war experience only served to grow the membership rolls of the NAACP. Their ranks grew from 50,000 in 1940 to 450,000 in 1946. The civil rights organization faced an uphill battle as white Southerners doubled down their efforts to prevent economic, political, and social subjugation of African Americans. These efforts arose partly out of fear returning African Americans would not continue their work as sharecroppers, and many did leave the South altogether. Mississippi Senator James O. Eastland spoke about white soldiers from the South coming home expecting to find the integrity of institutions of the South unimpaired, and that those boys were fighting to maintain white supremacy. Racial discrimination wasn't just limited to military service. It extended to veteran benefits as well. On June 22, 1944, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill, was passed. It was designed to reward military service. The GI Bill was often credited as creating the American middle class. Between 1944 and 1971, the federal government spent over $95 billion providing benefits to veterans. In 1948, the GI Bill made up 15% of the federal budget. It created opportunities for home ownership, higher education, vocational training, and provided capital for veterans to start their own businesses. Before the end of the war, Black newspapers printed articles about the legislation and outlined eligibility requirements. The GI Bill gave Black soldiers in the community hope that their service would give them unprecedented opportunities for economic advancement. As you would expect, the GI Bill led to a middle class that was overwhelmingly white. Black soldiers were denied access to programs within the GI Bill because the GI Bill was designed to accommodate Jim Crow. While the bill contained no language limiting racial segregation or excluding African Americans, it was also crafted with limited federal oversight. The bill gave all administrative responsibility to the states with limited congressional supervision. State authorities had virtually unchecked power to discriminate against Black veterans. In Title III of the GI Bill, it made veterans eligible for low-interest home loans with no down payment, but very few Black veterans were able to benefit from this. These loans were guaranteed by the VA, but because they required the cooperation of local banks, Black veterans had to convince local banks to lend them the money. This proved to be a daunting task for Black veterans because of the overwhelming majority of banks denied loans to Black applicants. Home ownership was the primary driver of post-war economic security and wealth accumulation. It spurred the creation and growth of white suburbia. GI Bill completely failed to uplift Black veterans and their families in the same way it had done white Americans. And once again, Black people were excluded from the benefits of their military service, and the hopes of Black veterans was crushed by racism. After World War II officially ended in September 2nd, 1945, Black soldiers returned home to find that not only were they denied benefits and economic opportunities, but that their veteran status and military service made them targets for racial violence, especially those in uniform. For many veterans, the first confrontation with this post-war racial system was on the bus ride home. In February 1946, Marine Timothy Hood removed a Jim Crow sign from a trolley in Bessemer, Alabama. In response, the white streetcar conductor, William R. Weeks, shot Hood 5 times. As Hood staggered off, he was actually arrested by the chief of police, J.B. Fant. Fant then placed Hood in the back of his police car and shot him in the head with a single bullet. Fant would later allege that Hood had reached in his hip pocket to draw a gun, although there was no evidence that Hood was armed. The coroner's findings would rule this a justifiable homicide, and Fant was ultimately cleared. By this time, attacks on Black veterans were slightly more likely to result in investigations and charges against white perpetrators, but they still rarely led to convictions or any actual punishment because many states barred African Americans and women from serving on juries, and because Jim Crow was so completely ingrained in every aspect of American society. In December of 1946, Harry Truman appointed a panel to serve at the President's Commission on Civil Rights, which recommended that more adequate means and procedures for protection of civil rights of people in the United States. When the commission issued its report in October 1947, among its proposals were an anti-lynching bill, laws against polling taxes, a permanent FEPC, and strengthening civil rights division of the Justice Department. In February of 1948, Truman called Congress to act on these recommendations, and Southern senators threatened a filibuster. Truman moved ahead on civil rights by using his executive powers. On July 26, 1948, he issued executive order abolishing segregation in the armed forces and ordering a full integration of all services. Executive Order 9981 stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed forces without regard to color, race, religion, or national origin. The order established an advisory committee to examine the rules and practices and procedures in the armed services and recommended ways to desegregate. There was still considerable resistance from the military, but by the end of the Korean conflict, almost all of the armed forces were completely integrated. With the world on the brink of war, the United States started mobilizing for World War II. Military officials began to debate whether or not African American soldiers should be used in armored units. Many in the military and politicians believed that blacks did not have the brains, quickness, or moral stamina to fight. Colonel James A. Moss, commander of the 357th Infantry Regiment, spoke about his World War I experiences, stating, "As fighting troops, the Negro must be rated as second-class material, and this is primarily due to his inferior intelligence and lack of mental and moral qualifications." And Secretary of War Henry L. Stinson was resigned to the fact that blacks would serve in the military, but had very strong reservations about their capabilities in specific areas like the armored force. The military firmly embraced these beliefs leading up to World War II, even though African Americans had fought with courage and distinction in every major war since the Revolutionary War, and completely overlooked the fact that during World War I, 4 black regiments had served with the French, and their efforts were recognized by the French government, and 3 of the 4 regiments were awarded the coveted Croix de Guerre by the French military. Only the United States Chief of Ground Forces, Lieutenant General Leslie Nair, was the voice of reason for African Americans serving in armored units. He believed that the nation could not afford to exclude any potential asset. Although many in the military didn't see a need for African Americans in armored units, McNair was determined that black men would fight. So, with McNair's unwavering support, the black press, the NAACP, and the Congress for Racial Equality, all placing increasing pressure on the War Department and Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration to allow black soldiers to serve and see combat. So in the summer of 1940, the Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act. The act stated that in the selection and training of men in this act, there shall be no discrimination on any persons based on color or race. But in October, the White House issued a statement stating that the service of Negroes will be utilized on a fair, equitable basis, and the policy of segregation in the armed forces would continue to mirror social norms. Back during World War I, the 1st Light Tank Battalion was organized in France under Lieutenant Colonel George S. Patton Jr. In his command, these battles gave the idea of how better tanks could accomplish greater things on the battlefield in the future. He saw the Tank Corps as an independent combat arm. However, the Army's high command and members of the United States Congress didn't share Patton's views. The National Defense Act of 1920 would abolish the Tank Corps as an independent arm. Tank units then became under control of the infantry. It wouldn't be for 20 years that the armored force was created. With the outbreak of World War II in Europe, the American Army prepared for war with the creation of the armored force and headquartered it in Fort Knox, July 10th of 1940. It was responsible for establishing armored formations, doctrine, training, and then the use of armored vehicles. The Selective Service Act was then implemented, and thousands of citizen soldiers were ordered to report to Fort Knox and introduced to tanks. See, the U.S. lagged behind Europe in both tank development and tactics, with the Army believing that Germany had a superior tank force. Also, many students arrived at Fort Knox with either no military training or had yet to attend basic training. So this created tremendous urgency within the tank force, who compensated for this urgency with a frenzied, comprehensive training approach. Amid this training frenzy, the first group of black tankers arrived in Fort Knox, Kentucky in March of 1941 for armored warfare training with the 758 Tank Battalion, the first of 3 battalions to serve with the 5th Tank Group, the only predominantly black tank outfit established in the military during World War II. The 5th Tank Group was commanded by Colonel Leroy Nichols and was made up of black enlisted personnel with white officers, but these officers would gradually be replaced with black officers as they completed training. These pioneering black tankers trained in light tank operations, mechanics, and in related phases of mechanic warfare on the M5 light tank. Once the 758 Tank Battalion was in place, 2 more tank battalions were needed to complete the 5th Tank Group. So in March 15th of 1942, the War Department activated the 761 Tank Battalion in Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, and then in September 15th of 1943, the 761 Tank Battalion was moved to Camp Hood, Texas for advanced training, and there they changed from light to medium tanks. It would be to April 1st of 1943 that the final battalion, the 784, would be activated. Many of the enlisted men and officers never left Fort Hood because of the racism that they experienced in the local towns. On July 6, 1944, one of the 761's few black officers, Lieutenant Jackie Roosevelt Robinson, was riding on a civilian bus from Camp Hood to the nearby town of Belton. He refused to get to the back of the bus when asked by the driver, although the Army had commissioned this to be an unsegregated bus line. When the bus reached the end of the line, the bus driver summoned the military police, who then took Robinson into custody, and court-martial charges would ensue. But it would not not proceed because the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, would not consent to the charges. The top brass at Fort Hood then transferred Robinson to the 758 Tank Battalion, whose commander immediately signed the court-martial consent. Robinson was charged with violating the 63rd and 64th Articles of War for having disrespected General Baer of the military police. He was eventually acquitted and given an honorable discharge in November 1944. 3 years later, he would go on to break baseball's color barrier. Although many within the 761 thought they would never see combat, the men of the 761 still trained hard to prove that they could fight through seemingly endless maneuvers through early of 1944. The high marks and hard work during training did not go unnoticed by Army's high command. General Ben Lear, commander of the U.S. Second Army, rated the unit as superior after a special review and deemed the unit combat ready. Still, it was seemingly unlikely in this late stage of the war that they would actually see combat. But on June 6, the Allies implemented Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Europe. With American forces already experiencing heavy casualties, particularly among M4 Sherman tanks, the 761 was now the best trained and most able-bodied armored force in the United States military. So on October 10th, 1944, after 2 years of intense training, the 761 landed in France via Omaha Beach and then moved to Belgium at the beginning of November. The unit was assigned to General George Patton's 3rd Army at his request and attached to the 22nd Infantry Battalion. General Patton famously gave the Black Panthers a welcome, stating, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight with the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I've seen nothing but the best in my army, and I don't care what color you are as long as you go out there and you kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you, and most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn it, don't let me down." Privately, however, Patton harbored the same doubts as many of his white officers about black soldiers and was still sort of reluctant to commit to them in combat. On November 8th, 1944, the Black Panthers became the first African-American armored unit to enter combat, and they came under heavy fire in the towns of Montvic and Victorville. During the attack, the men encountered a roadblock that held up their advance. Without waiting for orders, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers climbed out of his tank under heavy enemy fire, attached a cable to the roadblock, and removed it. Barely a week later, Reuben Rivers was fatally wounded, providing cover fire while his men retreated from an enemy attack. For his valor, he received 2 Silver Stars and in 1997, the Congressional Medal of Honor. On November 10th, Sergeant Warren G.H. Creasy fought through enemy positions with the aid of his men until his Sherman tank was destroyed. Creasy jumped out, took charge of the .30 caliber machine gun on a nearby American half-track, and used it to wipe out the enemy position that had just destroyed his tank. The following day, leading another tank attack when his tank was bogged down in the mud, Creasy again dismounted under heavy enemy fire and worked to extricate it from the mud. While he was doing so, he saw that the 26th Infantry Division was pinned down with the enemy beginning a counterattack. Without hesitation, Creasy climbed up to a turret of a .50 caliber machine gun and used it to suppress the enemy while the foot soldiers would retreat. It seemed the more fire he drew, the harder he fought. After that battle, he too received a civil medal for gallantry in action. The Black Panthers would continue on and push, but at this point they were in desperate need of personnel replacements and low on functioning tanks. All of these things at this point in the war were hard to come by. So as a result, the 761 was not committed to fight in the first days of the Battle of the Bulge. But in January of 1945, they were sent into action again. And from December 31st, 1944 to February 2nd of 1945, the 761 took part in the American counteroffensive following the Battle of the Bulge. During a major battle in Tittle, Belgium, the 761 fought for 2 continuous days against German panzer and infantry units before the Germans withdrew in the face of a heavy Black Panther attack. Later, as the armored force of the 103 Infantry Division, the 761 took part in assaults that resulted in the breach of the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was the German defense system that stretched almost 400 miles on the western part of Germany. From March 20th to March 23rd of 1945, they operated far in advance of friendly artillery and faced vicious German resistance. Elements of the 761 destroyed several defensive positions along the Siegfried Line, captured 7 German towns, and during that 3-day period, the battalion inflicted 4,000 casualties on the German army and fought elements of 14 different German divisions. April 26, 1945, the Black Panthers will be one of the first U.S. battalions to meet up with Soviet forces, converging with the Russian army in Steyr, Austria. The convergence of Russian and U.S. armies split the last of the German army in two and hastened the end of the war in Europe. May 8, 1945, officially ended the war in Europe. The 761 will remain in Germany for another year before being deactivated June 1st, 1946. During combat operations in World War II, the Black Panthers served for 183 consecutive days without relief. Most frontline troops rarely spent more than a few weeks among the front lines. The 761 was known as the Bastard Battalion because elements of the battalion served with several different infantry divisions in support roles. The Black Panthers fought in major engagements in 6 different European countries and participated in 4 major Allied campaigns. They were aligned at various times to the 3rd, 6th, and 9th Army, and the unit inflicted 130,000 casualties on the German army and captured, destroyed, or aided in the liberation of more than 30 towns, several concentration camps, 4 airfields, and 3 supply dumps. All of this was accomplished despite the loss of 71 tanks and an overall casualty rate approaching 50%. The 761 was highly decorated, earning throughout the 6 months of their combat operation 7 Silver Stars for Valor, 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor. In 1976, the 761 Tank Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation. In 2005, a monument dedicated to 761 Tank Battalion was unveiled at Fort Hood, Texas. It serves as a permanent tribute to the Black soldiers who fought and served for liberty, honor, and democracy. Prior to World War II, racial segregation was the rule for most of the country, and many in the military believed that Black soldiers were simply inferior to whites and performed relatively poorly in combat and were completely incapable of flying airplanes. A 1925 study conducted by the Army War College concluded that African Americans were inherently ill-suited for combat physically and psychologically. So the United States continued their policy of segregating Blacks and whites as well as limiting their roles within the military. In 1938, with Europe teetering on the brink of another Great War, Congress passed Public Law 18, which authorized the training of military pilots for the Air Corps at civilian colleges and universities. It was referred to as the Civilian Pilot Training Program. See, the United States Air Force wasn't created until 1947, and prior to that, flying in the military meant that you were a part of the Army branch, which is called the United States Air Corps. During the beginning of this program, the military simply refused to offer the training program at Black colleges. So a Howard University student lodged a lawsuit in protest, and thanks to the mounting pressure from Black newspapers, the NAACP, and even Eleanor Roosevelt, in September of 1940, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration responded to this lobbying campaign by announcing that the AAC planned to establish an experimental training program for Black pilots, and this led to the creation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron. For the training site, the War Department chose Tuskegee Army Airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, which was then under construction. Many in the Black community were stunned by the choice of Tuskegee, Alabama, giving the South's reputation of racial intolerance. Others felt like it was a fitting tribute to Booker T. Washington, who had built Tuskegee Institute from scratch in 1881 and served as an advisor for Theodore Roosevelt. The 99th would consist of 35 pilots and 300 ground personnel, managed by white officers. Since it was an insult for white officers to be assigned to Black troops, the War Department decided to use voluntary white non-commissioned officers to supervise, but they will be replaced by Black officers as soon as the officers were qualified. In addition to 1,000 pilots, the Tuskegee program trained over 14,000 navigators, bombardiers, instructors, aircraft and machine mechanics, control tower operators, and other maintenance and support staff. Those that possess the physical and mental qualifications to be accepted in the aviation cadets program would initially be trained as single-engine pilots and would later then be trained on twin-engine planes, navigators, and bombardiers. The cadets received 15 weeks of primary training. After the completion, the cadets would then move on to combat pilot training. Most of these cadets were either college graduates or undergrads that demonstrated academic qualifications for comprehensive entrance exams. No military standards were lowered for these pilots or any of the support personnel. The first aviation cadet class began in July 1941, and despite the official report stating that there will be 35 black pilot trainees, only 13 started the class. The cadets lived in dreadful conditions at Tuskegee Airfield while it was being completed. They stayed in tents, ate in a mess hall that was pretty much four walls with a dirt floor, and with what little free time they had, they couldn't go to downtown Tuskegee because of the hostility of the white townspeople and because it was strictly segregated. After 9 months, in March of 1942, only 5 successfully completed the training program, one of them being Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate. The other 4 were commissioned second lieutenant, and all 5 received the Army Air Corps Silver Pilot Wings. With America now at war, there was greater urgency to train personnel for combat. The 99th Fighter Squadron would have to wait for their opportunity to perform in combat, and many asked if they intended to be used at all. But in April 1st, 1943, the 99th got word they'd been called up, and the following morning, the men boarded a train for New York that then left for North Africa and later Sicily. 400 members of the 99th and 3,500 white servicemen all fell under the command of now Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis. He was the first black officer to ever command white troops. Early on, the 99 flew sometimes as many as 3 to 4 missions a day. The average white pilot only flew 50 missions before being rotated out. The 99 flew as many as 70 plus missions before being relieved. The men of the 99 knew that they could not break under the intense pressure because they were under a magnifying glass. After the commander of the 99th Assigned Fighter Squadron Group, Harold R. Maddox, complained about the 99th performance, Benjamin Davis had to defend his before a War Department committee. This led to the 99th being moved to Italy, where they served alongside the 79th Fighter Group. Early in 1944, this was a turning point for the 99th, where they shot down 12 German planes in just 2 days. Later, in April of 1944, a study that covered the actions of the 99th during 1943 and early 1944 was completed, and the study read that an examination of the record of the 99th Fighter Squadron reveals no significant differences between this squadron and the balance of the P-40 squadrons in the Mediterranean theater of operations. The report recognized the 99th as a superior tactical fighter unit, and this report and the heroic efforts completely changed the military's view of the 99th and black airmen. Around this same time, early in 1944, the 100th, the 301, and the 302 fighter squadrons arrived in Italy. These black squadrons made up the newly formed all-black 332nd Fighter Group, led by promoted again Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. As soon as the 99th was transferred to the 332nd Fighter Group, then the 332nd was then reassigned to the 15th Strategic Air Force in Ramitelli, Italy. The group then received new planes, P-37 Thunderjets, to escort heavy bombers during raids of enemy territory. The 332nd painted the tails of their planes with red tails because they wanted bomber pilots to know who was escorting them when they looked out the window, earning them the enduring nickname Red Tails. Over the course of the war, the 332nd flew 15,000 combat sorties, over 1,500 missions, and sent 450 pilots into battle. The Tuskegee Airmen shot down 112 German aircraft, destroyed 950 ground units, and sank a destroyer using only machine gun fire alone. While none of the Tuskegee Airmen achieved A status, 3 airmen, Captain Edward Toppins, Captain Joseph Eisenberry, and First Lieutenant Lee Archer, shot down 4 planes during their service in Europe. However, the most distinctive and controversial achievement of the Tuskegee Airmen was that no friendly bomber was lost to enemy aircraft during 2,000 escort missions was most likely not true. In March of 1945, the Chicago Defender stated that no bomber escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen was lost to enemy fire. This statement was simply repeated and not challenged for years. Later, A detailed analysis will find that the 332nd lost at least 25 bombers over the course of the war. However, the report does credit the airmen with not losing a bomber to an escort mission over a 6-month period between September of 1944 and March of 1945. Despite this, the airmen had a much better success rate than any other bomber escort group in the 15th Air Force, who lost on average 46 bombers during the exact same period. Even with all their successes, the Tuskegee officers found that when they returned from Europe, they were still second-class citizens at home. Their contributions to American freedoms had not endured them to their white military brothers. In March of 1945, the last of the Tuskegee Group, the 477th Medium Bombardment Group, moved to Godman Field adjacent to Fort Knox, to Freeman Field because of better facilities. Tensions between the 477th and the white command structure on the base were tense from the moment they arrived. The commanding officer of the base, Colonel Robert Segway, moved quickly to set up and enforce a segregated system. The 477th was housed in dilapidated buildings, and Colonel Segway also created a system to deny black airmen entry into the officers' club. He classified black airmen as trainees, even though they had all finished flight school. Therefore, they were commissioned officers. As trainees, they were forced to use a rundown, non-commissioned officers' club nicknamed Uncle Tom's Cabin. This occurred despite an order issued in 1940 by President Roosevelt himself that no officer should be denied entrance into the officers' club. April 5th, 1945, a group of black officers peacefully entered the Freeman Field Officers Club in protest of direct orders for them to stay out. 103 officers were arrested and charged with insubordination and faced court-martial. The court-martial proceedings were quickly dropped against all but one of the officers, Lieutenant Roger Bill Terry, who was convicted for brushing up against a superior officer while trying to enter the club. 50 years later, in August of 1995, 15 of the original 103 officers who were arrested received official notification that their military records had been expunged of any reference to the Freeman Field incident, and also Mr. Terry's court-martial conviction had been reversed and his military record cleaned. Even after the war in Europe, the Tuskegee Airmen returned home to the United States and faced continued racism, bigotry, despite their outstanding war record. Tuskegee Army Airfield continued to train new airmen until 1946, with women entering the program in several support fields. A large number of black airmen elected to remain in the service, but because of segregation, their assignments were limited to the 332nd Fighter Group or the 477th Composite Group. Opportunities for advancement and promotion were severely limited. Nonetheless, black airmen continued to perform superbly, and from 1941-1946, 996 pilots graduated from Tuskegee Army Airfield, receiving commissions and pilot's wings. In 1947, the newly formed U.S. Air Force initiated plans to integrate all its units. The Army was also on demand and needed qualified people, but were unable to get experienced black personnel because of their segregation policy. In 1948, Harry Truman enacted Executive Order 9981, which directed equal treatment and opportunity for all in the United States Armed Forces. This order, in time, led to the end of racial segregation in the armed forces. This also was the first step towards racial integration in the United States. The Tuskegee Airmen performed outstandingly during World War II, and each airman accepted the challenge and proudly displayed their skill and determination while suppressing their eternal rage from the humiliation and indignation of frequent experiences with racism and bigotry. These airmen fought 2 wars, internally and externally, and still, the positive experience for the United States military, the outstanding record of accomplishment, the superb behavior of the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II and after were major factors in the initiation of historic social change that worked to achieve racial equality in the United States. African Americans served in the Civil War, World War I, and World War II for the ideals of freedom, justice, and democracy, only to return to racial terror and violence. White Americans, intent on maintaining white supremacy and a racial hierarchy, targeted black veterans with violence and lynching because they represented hope and the possibility of black empowerment and social equality. The hope threatened to disrupt the entrenched social, economic, and political forces and to inspire large segments of the black community to participate in activism that could deal a serious blow to the system of segregation and oppression that had been aligned for nearly a century and was rooted in the myth of the differences between the two races that is older than this nation itself. Despite this overwhelming injustice, the horrific acts on Black veterans suffered during the era of racial terror, they maintained the determined to fight at home for what they hoped to achieve abroad. This commitment contributed to the spirit that would launch the civil rights movement. Thank you. I'm your host, Country Boy. And if you like this, you love this, you can find more like this at onemichistory.com. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. Peace.